I'm sitting in my pickup, not moving, staring at a line of brake lights that stretches farther than I can see. Snow drifts down in thick, quiet sheets, settling on hoods and windshields while engines idle and exhaust curls into the air. Someone, a few cars ahead, leans out their window and shouts. Another driver slams a hand against the steering wheel. Nothing changes. I glance past the traffic and see the gate. Closed. Chain wrapped tight. Padlock clean and new, like it was put there with confidence. I check my phone, then set it face down in the cup holder. I don't need to read the messages yet. I already know what they say. My wife isn't getting to work. Parents are standing around waiting for a school bus that can't get through. Somewhere up the road, an ambulance already tried and had to turn back. The HOA says this is about safety, about liability, about protecting the neighborhood from lawsuits. I warned them. I said closing this road in winter would choke the entire valley. I said the second road wouldn't hold. They smiled, nodded, and moved on. A sheriff's cruiser inches into view, tires slipping as it tries to turn around in the snow. I set my coffee down without taking a sip. The HOA didn't just lock a gate. They locked themselves into a mistake they can't undo quietly. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Clearwater Ridge doesn't look dangerous at first glance. In summer, it's just trees, quiet roads, and long driveways that disappear into the hills. But winter rewrites everything. We sit just outside Hawthorne Falls, high enough that storms settle in and don't hurry out. When snow comes down here, it doesn't ask whether you're ready. And when it does, roads stop being amenities and start being lifelines. I've lived here long enough to know which ones matter. I drive a pickup with a plow I paid for myself years ago. Not for business, not for favors, just because it made sense. When storms hit, I clear my driveway, then the neighbors, then whoever needs help next. Sometimes the county plows arrive later, sometimes they don't. Either way, people get out. Kids make it to school. Emergency vehicles don't have to guess. On paper, Clearwater Ridge has 2 access roads. The HOA loved repeating that fact. What the paperwork never showed was elevation, shade, or ice. The second road climbs hard, stays in shadow most of the day, and turns slick the moment temperatures dip. I've seen cars slide backward on it. I've watched delivery trucks stop halfway and give up. By midwinter, everyone who actually lives here knows the truth. There's only one road that works. That truth collided headfirst with the new HOA board. They came in after an election built on clean language and calm promises. Order, stability, property values. Marilyn Price led the ticket. She spoke like someone used to responsibility, the kind of person who uses phrases like risk exposure and long-term impact. She didn't sound power-hungry. She sounded convinced she was preventing something worse. At first, the changes were small. Parking notices, trash cans measured down to the inch, a few warning slips tucked under windshield wipers. People complained, but they complied. No one wanted to be the neighbor who pushed back. Then the escalation came, fast and clean. First strike, the polite warning. A letter on HOA letterhead, courteous language. It said I was operating outside approved HOA processes by coordinating snow removal and advising neighbors on safe routes. It asked me to stop. No fines mentioned, no threats. Just a reminder that the board was aware. Second strike, the threat. A thicker envelope a few days later, legal language. Liability language. It warned that if someone were injured after following guidance that didn't come from the HOA, the association could be exposed to lawsuits. The HOA fund was mentioned. Insurance premiums were mentioned. My name appeared more than once. Third strike, the nuclear option. No letter this time, no discussion. Just an email sent late at night to every resident. The main road was now classified as HOA-controlled infrastructure, and subject to closure during winter conditions to reduce liability and reset traffic patterns. I read it once. Then I looked out the window. Snow had started falling again. Messages started coming in almost immediately. A parent asking what this meant for the school bus. An older couple wondering what they were supposed to do if the weather got worse. Someone sent a photo of the secondary road already starting to glaze over. That night, I drove it myself. Tires slipped, just easing onto the incline. I backed down, parked at the bottom, and left the engine running. Snow tapped against the windshield, erasing tracks as fast as they formed. The road looked calm in the dark, the kind of calm that hides how fast things go wrong. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Coats stayed on. Snow melted into the carpet. Marilyn spoke calmly, laying out her reasoning. One accident, she said, could drain reserves and force dues up for everyone. Closing the road wasn't about control. It was about protecting the community from lawsuits. She sounded reasonable. When it was my turn, I kept it short. I didn't argue numbers. I described the grade of the secondary road. The shade, the way it loses traction after sunset. I talked about what happens when a bus stops halfway up that incline. What happens when an ambulance tries to come down in a hurry. Marilyn nodded, then said evenly that the board couldn't let one homeowner dictate how the neighborhood operated. Chairs shifted. Someone behind me exhaled sharply. After the meeting, I sent one last email. No emotion, just attachments. Old correspondence with the county. Notes from previous winters. A suggestion to delay any closure until after the storm passed. No response came. Instead, another notice went out. The main road would be closed Monday morning. I set my phone down on the counter and looked out at the driveway already turning white. Snow was picking up again, steady and patient. I didn't finish my coffee. I just stood there, watching the weather do exactly what it always does. By then, it was clear this wasn't about policy anymore. They were betting the storm wouldn't prove them wrong. The reaction didn't build slowly. It hit all at once. By early morning, phones were lighting up across Clearwater Ridge. Not arguments. Questions. The same ones, over and over, from people who already knew the answers were bad. Parents asking if anyone had heard from the school district. A delivery driver asking which route he was supposed to use now. Someone forwarded the HOA policy email again, this time with sections highlighted, like maybe reading it harder would change what it said. Outside, the snow kept falling. The board followed up before noon, doubling down. Another message went out, calm and confident, repeating that the main road was HOA controlled and that temporary closure was necessary to reduce liability exposure. They framed it like a safety reset, a short inconvenience that would prevent something worse. I read it, then looked through the windshield at the sky pressing down lower and darker than forecast. Neighbors started stopping by in person, not to argue. To check. A couple with a toddler asked what would happen if the bus couldn't get through. An older man who relied on weekly medical visits stood in my driveway with his hands in his pockets, looking past me at the road instead of at my face. That evening's HOA meeting was full again. Boots by the door, jackets still zipped. The room smelled like wet wool and melting snow. Marilyn stood at the front, posture steady, and spoke the way she always did when she believed she was being responsible. She talked about lawsuits, about insurance carriers, about how one serious crash could empty the HOA fund and force everyone's dues up for years. She said the board had a duty to prevent that risk, even if it meant making an unpopular call. No one interrupted her. When it was my turn, I didn't challenge her logic head-on. I didn't accuse her of overreach. I talked about the road, the incline, the shade, the way ice forms there before plows can even get traction. I described what happens when a school bus has to stop halfway up that hill. What happens when an ambulance tries to descend it without chains? Marilyn listened, nodded once, then said evenly that the board couldn't allow individual homeowners to undermine official safety decisions. A chair scraped softly behind me. Someone muttered something under their breath. After the meeting, I waited, hoping someone from the board would stay back and talk. Most of them avoided eye contact. One said Marilyn was worried about personal liability if something went wrong. Another said the policy had already been approved and reversing it would make the board look weak. I sent emails anyway, short ones. No emotion. I attached old county correspondence and asked for a delay until the storm passed. I suggested opening the road during active snowfall and reviewing the policy later. Nothing came back. Late Sunday night, another notice went out. Brief. Final. The main road would be closed Monday morning at first light. No exceptions listed. No emergency language added. I set my phone down and walked to the window. Snow was already collecting along the fence line, smooth and undisturbed. The forecast had been wrong. It was coming down harder now, thicker, the kind that erases tracks as fast as they form. They weren't enforcing a rule. They were assuming the weather would behave. And up here, that assumption never holds. The storm didn't wait for morning. I woke before my alarm to the sound of wind pushing snow against the house in uneven bursts. The room was still dark, but the light outside had that dull glow it gets when the ground is already covered. I pulled on a jacket, stepped onto the porch, and stomped. Snow had piled up fast, thick and heavy, already swallowing the edges of the driveway. I didn't stand there long. I got in the truck and drove. The secondary road was first. I eased onto it slowly, barely touching the gas. The tires slipped anyway. Halfway up the initial incline, the rear end drifted just enough to make the point for me. I backed down, straightened out, and parked at the bottom. Snow filled in my tracks almost immediately. I sat there with the engine running, watching the road disappear under fresh white. No plow marks. No grip. Nothing about it said alternate route. I pulled out my phone and called Marilyn. It rang, then stopped. I tried again, straight to voicemail. I left a short message. No accusations. No tone, just the facts. The storm was worse than forecast. The road wouldn't hold. Closing the main road that morning would trap people. I hung up and drove toward the entrance. The sky was just beginning to lighten when I saw the gate. Closed. Chain wrapped tight. Padlock clean, bright, and unmistakable. No sign posted. No one from the HOA around. Just the gate, sitting there like it was proud of itself. The first car arrived seconds later. Load, stopped. The driver leaned forward, stared, then threw both hands up. Another car pulled in behind it. Then another. Headlights stacked up in the snowfall, each new arrival realizing too late that there was nowhere to go. A few drivers tried to turn around. Tires spun. One sedan slid sideways before correcting. A delivery truck attempted to back up and jackknifed, blocking part of the lane. Hazard lights blinked uselessly through the snow. People started getting out of their cars. Someone shouted toward the gate. Someone else kicked at the snow in frustration. A parent stood on the shoulder with a phone pressed to their ear, pacing in short steps. My phone buzzed. A text from a neighbor. The school bus was stuck halfway up the secondary road, wheels spinning. Kids still inside. Another buzz. Someone else, an ambulance, tried to approach from the far side and had to reroute. I looked from the messages to the gate, then back at the snow still coming down, steady and unbothered. I didn't touch the chain. I didn't argue with anyone. I stepped back into my truck and called the county road office. When someone answered, I spoke slowly. I gave the location. I described the gate. I described the conditions on both roads. I mentioned the school bus. I mentioned the ambulance. The questions came fast after that. Who authorized the closure? whether there was an emergency plan, whether the road was designated for winter access. I answered each one plainly. No, no, no. Yes. A pause. Then a different voice came on the line and told me to stay where I was and keep my phone on. I set the phone down and stepped out of the truck again. Snow had already started covering my footprints. A sheriff's cruiser appeared at the far end of the line not long after, lights cutting through the white. It slowed, stopped, and the deputy stepped out, looking from the gate to the road and back again. He didn't say much. He just took it in. Standing there, watching the line of cars grow longer by the minute, it was clear something had shifted. This wasn't a neighborhood inconvenience anymore. A locked gate had turned into a problem that reached well past Clearwater Ridge. The gate was still closed, but it didn't belong to the HOA alone anymore. Standing there in the snow, watching people wait with nowhere to go, I stopped reacting and started organizing. Years earlier, I'd spent time on a county advisory board that dealt with emergency access routes in rural areas. It wasn't political work, it was practical. Maps spread across tables, winter scenarios, arguments about which roads stayed open when everything else failed. That experience came back to me now, not as a memory, but as a checklist. I made the call back to the county and put the phone on the dash so I could keep my hands free. The confirmation came quickly and without drama. The main road into Clearwater Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood street. During winter conditions, it was designated as a shared emergency access corridor. That designation existed because the secondary road was steep, shaded, and unreliable in storms. The HOA could manage day-to-day issues in fair weather, but they did not have authority to close that road during an active winter event. Not without coordination, not without approval. Not at all. I didn't argue the point. I didn't need to. I looked at the gate again, then at the line of cars, then at the snow piling up on the hood. I took the coffee out of the cup holder and set it on the floor. I hadn't touched it since earlier. If this was going to be handled properly, it was going to be handled with facts. I started with photos. The gate from both sides, the chain wrapped tight. The lock, snow building up around the base. I stepped back far enough to capture the line of traffic behind it, headlights stacked into the snowfall. I made sure the timestamps were visible. Then I recorded short videos, a sedan trying to turn around and sliding sideways before correcting, a driver backing down carefully, feet planted on the brake, the delivery truck sitting crooked where it had jackknifed, hazard lights blinking against the white. Neighbors came up to me asking what was happening. I didn't speculate. I asked them to text me what they were seeing. One message described the school bus stuck on the hill, engine running, kids waiting. Another described an elderly couple abandoning their car and walking back home because the tires wouldn't grip. Each message was a record, not a rumor. About an hour into it, the sheriff's deputy walked over. He'd been standing back, watching, radio clipped to his shoulder. I introduced myself and gave him the short version. Gate locked. Secondary road unusable. County says the main road is an emergency corridor. He didn't react right away. He walked the length of the gate, tugged lightly on the chain, then turned and looked at the line of cars stretching back into the snow. He keyed his radio and spoke quietly, giving details I couldn't hear. When he finished, he stood there a moment longer watching another car try the secondary road and slide back down. "That's not going to work," he said, more to himself than to me. Then my phone buzzed again. Another email from the HOA. I opened it standing there in the cold, breath fogging the screen. It had gone out to every resident. The subject line talked about compliance. The body blamed non-compliant residents for the traffic situation, claiming people were ignoring alternate routing guidance and creating congestion. It warned that interference with HOA traffic control measures could result in enforcement action. I read it once. Then I handed the phone to the deputy. He read it slowly, then let out a breath through his nose and handed it back. "That's helpful," he said. I forwarded the email to the county contact immediately. Then I sent the photos, the videos, the timestamps. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The HOA had put their position in writing while the road was locked and emergency access was compromised. That was the moment things changed. The county called back within minutes. The tone was different now, focused, direct. What had started as a traffic problem was now being treated as a documented safety violation. They asked me to stay where I was, keep collecting information, and remain available. County equipment was being dispatched. The HOA would be contacted directly. I looked back at the gate. Snow was already halfway up the bottom rail. Cars were still stuck. People were still waiting. But the situation had moved beyond the HOA's control. They thought they were managing risk, thought they were protecting themselves from liability. Instead, they'd created the exact scenario they claimed to fear and handed over proof of it themselves. I put the phone back in my pocket and stood there in the snow, watching the deputy make another call. The wind picked up. Snow filled in my footprints again. The gate was still locked, but the clock was no longer on the HOA's side. The emergency meeting was called for that evening. The notice framed it as a chance to clarify misinformation, but the timing said everything. Control was slipping, and the board was trying to get back in front of it. The room filled quickly. Coats stayed on, boots lined the walls. The heat was turned up too high, and the air felt thick before anyone spoke. Marilyn sat at the front with the rest of the board, papers stacked neatly, posture straight. When the door finally closed, she began. She talked for a long time. About liability, about insurance carriers, about how one accident on an icy road could drain the HOA fund and raise dues for everyone. She said the board had a responsibility to protect the community, even if people didn't like the decision. She didn't sound angry. She sounded convinced. When she finished, the room waited. I stood up. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't say a word. I walked to the table, set my phone down in the center, turned the volume all the way up, and pressed play. The sound filled the room, tires screeching, wind roaring, a car sliding sideways out of frame. Someone near the back sucked in a sharp breath. The video ended, and the silence afterward felt heavier than the noise had been. I tapped the screen again and put the phone on speaker. The county official's voice came through, calm and unmistakable. They didn't raise it. They didn't hedge. That gate is not authorized for closure during winter conditions. It's designated as an emergency access corridor. If it's not open within 1 hour, the sheriff will open it. No one spoke. The deputy, who had been standing quietly along the wall, stepped forward. He looked at Marilyn and said evenly, "You heard the county. Open it." Marilyn glanced down at her papers, flipped one over, then another, like something might be written there that could fix this. When she looked up again, the confidence was gone. She started to say something about policy language, about intent, but the words didn't land. Residents began to speak then, one at a time. A parent described waiting on the roadside while a bus sat stalled on the hill. An older man talked about turning his car around twice before giving up and walking home. Someone admitted they'd supported the board and didn't anymore. No shouting, no insults. Just facts, stacking up the same way the snow had that morning. Marilyn tried once more. She said the board acted within its rights. The deputy didn't raise his voice when he answered. Not anymore. The room went still. Chairs didn't move. No one whispered. Marilyn stared straight ahead, hands flat on the table, like she was holding it in place. The meeting ended without a vote and without closure. People pulled on coats and filed out quietly. The deputy stepped outside to make a call. I picked up my phone and headed for the door. The gate was still locked, but everyone in that room knew it wouldn't stay that way much longer. The gate came open that night, no announcement, no apology. Just county trucks rolling in through the snow with their lights flashing, crews stepping out like they'd done this 100 times before. One of them walked straight up to the chain, took a look at the lock, and nodded. Minutes later, the gate swung wide, metal creaking as if it had been waiting to give up. Plows followed immediately, real ones. Heavy blades scraping down to pavement, salt thrown thick and wide. The road changed in front of us, minute by minute. What had been a frozen line of stalled headlights turned into slow movement, then steady flow. Cars eased forward, cautious at first, then more confident. A few drivers rolled down their windows and waved. One shouted something I couldn't hear over the engine noise, but he was smiling. By morning, the focus had shifted. The county opened a formal investigation into the closure. Not just the physical gate, but the decision behind it. Emails were requested. Internal messages, timestamps. The message blaming non-compliant residents didn't help the board's case. It sat there in black and white, sent while people were stranded, emergency access compromised. Statements were taken. Parents talked about waiting with no information while their kids sat on a stalled bus. Residents described sliding backward on the secondary road, abandoning cars, walking home through fresh snow. The sheriff's report was short and direct. No emotion, no speculation, just facts. Within days, formal notices went out. Marilyn Price and 2 other board members were censured for unsafe governance and failure to coordinate emergency access during an active winter event. It wasn't dramatic, but it landed hard. The authority they'd been so careful to protect was now under review. That's when the neighborhood changed. People started talking openly. Group chats filled with questions about bylaws and recall procedures. Someone printed copies and passed them around. Signatures appeared faster than anyone expected. This wasn't about parking rules anymore. It was about trust. The recall vote was scheduled within weeks. It never happened. Days before the date, an email went out early in the morning. Short. Formal. Marilyn announced her resignation, citing personal reasons and thanking the community for the opportunity to serve. No mention of the storm, no explanation. No apology. No one was confused. Her departure collapsed what was left of the board. One member stepped down quietly. Another stopped attending meetings altogether. The recall vote went forward anyway, more out of habit than necessity. By then, the old leadership was already gone. Later that week, I stood near the entrance and watched traffic move through fresh snow without hesitation. Plows had cleared wide lanes. Tires held. A neighbor passed and lifted a hand from the steering wheel in a small wave. The gate stood open behind him. The HOA had tried to prove control by locking it. All they proved was how quickly authority disappears when it ignores reality. After the resignations, the neighborhood didn't snap back to normal overnight, but the shift was obvious. The county required an interim board, and for the first time, the process felt grounded. There were no speeches about authority or control, just a sign-up sheet, open chairs, and people who actually lived through the storm stepping forward. The first meetings were different from anything we'd seen before. County road officials sat at the same table as residents. Maps were spread out. Old designations were pulled up and read aloud. No one rushed anyone else. Questions were answered directly. When someone didn't know something, they said so and looked it up. Policies were rewritten from scratch. Emergency access was spelled out clearly in plain language. The main road was designated as always open during winter events. No discretion, no temporary resets. If snow was falling, the gate stayed open. Any exception required county coordination and written approval. The secondary road was finally labeled honestly, not as an alternative, but as weather-dependent and unsafe during heavy snowfall. The tension that had been hanging over Clearwater Ridge started to ease. People stopped whispering at meetings. Neighbors lingered to talk instead of rushing out. The sense that decisions were being made somewhere else, by people who didn't listen, began to fade. A few neighbors thanked me. Some did it quietly, pulling me aside in the parking lot. Others just nodded when they passed me on the road. I always gave the same answer. I didn't want a seat. I didn't want influence. I wanted the same thing everyone else did. A road that worked. Winter didn't change. Storms still rolled in without warning. Snow still piled up overnight. Wind still erased plow tracks faster than anyone liked. But the response was steady now. The gate stayed open. County trucks moved through when they needed to. Emergency vehicles didn't hesitate. Life went on. The difference wasn't the weather. It was trust. Trust that decisions wouldn't be made in isolation. Trust that safety wouldn't be traded for paperwork or ego. Every time I drove the main road after a fresh storm, I noticed how ordinary it felt. And after everything that had happened, that ordinariness felt like a victory. When I think back on how it ended, it isn't the meetings or the emails that stay with me. It's the quiet moments after, the gate standing open, snow still falling, cars moving through like they always should have. There was relief in that movement, not dramatic relief, just the kind that settles in your shoulders when you realize no one got hurt. The school bus made it through. An ambulance didn't lose time when it mattered. People got home without white knuckles on the steering wheel. Those were the things that counted, even if no one ever put them in a report. What surprised me most was the neighborhood itself. People who had stayed quiet found their voices. People who assumed decisions were out of their hands learned otherwise. No shouting. No grandstanding. Just a line that had been crossed and quietly pushed back into place. A few days later, I watched a neighbor pass through the entrance after another storm. He slowed, lifted a hand off the wheel, and waved. Nothing more than that. The gate was open behind him, snow pushed back to the shoulders, the road clear enough to trust. That was it. No speeches. No victory lap. Just a problem corrected before it became something worse. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?